Now, there are various ways to begin to think about the brain. As we saw, we come at the brain with a very, very different skill sets and very different kinds of questions. The anatomist and the clinician, um, they have different concerns from the physiologist. There's lots of ways to look at the brain, and there are certain flavors to this. Some people look at the brain as if it was the mirror to the soul. And if you're convinced that the brain is the producer of consciousness and the brain is essentially a meat version of the mind, then you're going to expect those soul-like qualities, your capacity to reason, to imagine, to think, you're going to expect to find them all in the brain. And we'll see that there's a very strong tradition in neuroscience that treats the brain this way. But it's very difficult to reconcile that way of approaching the brain with our knowledge that the brain is also an organ in an organism. As we saw when we compare the human brain to those of apes and even whales and elephants, there's an awful lot more that we have in common than that distinguishes us. And so any story that traffics in human exceptionalism has to deal with the fact that our brains don't look so exceptional, although we do have big frontal lobes. Now notice, I prefer to be a little bit uncertain here because I'm not sure how to describe myself. I'm not sure what kind of creature I am. The more certain you are that you know who and what you are, including such things as what your emotions are and what your imagination is and so on. If you're very certain about the contents of your soul, that's where you're going to look for it in the brain, and you might interpret what you see in those terms. Now, back in the 1800s, there was a vogue for understanding the brain precisely as the seat of the soul. And there was a business known as phrenology that arose, and it interpreted the brain as not a single organ, but as multiple organs. And different phrenologists had different numbers of organs. And each organ was associated with one of these human qualities that must be produced by the brain. So you can see such ideas as spirituality and combativeness and conscientiousness, self-esteem. These were human qualities that people were sure they had, were an essential part of being human, so they assumed the brain must have them. And phrenology went one further, of course, because the brain sits inside a housing called the skull. It assumed that if you were particularly, for example, mirthful, and so you had a big mirthful organ, then you'd have a bit of a bump there, so that we could actually tell something of your character by feeding your brain. This nonsense, and it is nonsense, phrenology is not respectable, is most closely associated with the Swiss anatomist Franz Joseph Gall, who was arguing this about 1800. By about 1850, that is around the time Charles Darwin was doing his work, this was by and largely discredited in science, but it had a hold on the popular imagination. And that hold has never really, really left. So we can see now that this is complete nonsense. That was clear by 1850. This particular diagram comes from an American Phrenological journal from 1843. So really after it had reached its sell-by date, there you can see the particular organs associated with mirthfulness and parental love. So at this stage, we're not dealing with a very respectable journal either. Phrenological ideas have escaped, and they lead people to form unreasonable views of what they can tell and not tell from, well, the shape of someone's head. So you get this kind of thing was very popular in Victorian times, how to tell the difference between a genuine husband and an unreliable husband. And as funny as that can be, it can also lead to the scientific production of racism. This was indeed used in order to demonstrate the clear superiority of the white European races over others. So phrenology is gone, hopefully. But this seductive idea that we can find ourselves in a brain, and that in doing so we'll find parts of the brain, and that we'll say that's the part for my good humor, my creativeness, and so on. That's a danger that we're always faced with. In fact, it's a danger that's become more acute over time because, as we'll see, we now have incredibly powerful imaging techniques that make images. But images don't interpret themselves. And there's a great temptation to interpret images always as if we were phrenologists. So if we assert that some part of the brain has a function, then we are interpreting the brain in our own self-image. And we do this. It's not necessarily phrenological, but the danger is there. So you got to be really sure that this function is plausible and that it's the kind of thing a part of the body could do. So in this course, I will refrain from asserting that one part of the brain produces any function. This is the bit for speech, this is the bit for this, that, and the other, for fear or desire or something like that. Interpreting the brain is the job of cognitive neuroscience, and it is an interpretive dance, an interpretive act, and it needs to be done with great caution. Whenever you see the equivalence of location, that is a place in the brain, with a function, what it does, beware. The leap is very seductive. It's very easy to make, very often compelling. It's always simplistic. It may be justified sometimes if we're careful. And we'll see that there are cases where we have good reason provisionally to think like this. But we need to be, given everything we've said, we need to be extremely cautious because ground truth is the brain is an organ of the body, and the human body belongs to the human animal, is not fully understood, nor do we have a perfect self-image.